So, regulation of credit, labor, and business here. Basically, we can talk, this is going to literally, obviously, it's going to be split into credit, labor, and business regulations. And again, think about these in terms of what incentives they provide people to invest in and use effectively the factors of production. So, who can own banks? Can foreign banks compete? Is there adequate private sector credit? In other words, as we're going to, again, as I've talked about before, all these issues here, as you can probably imagine, if we're getting millions and billions of people to coordinate their behavior, there's a lot of things that are interrelated. And so we are going to talk about the market for loanable funds here, or financial intermediation, before too long. And you can always come back and revisit this once we get to that point. But basically, if we have interest rate controls, that's going to decrease people's incentives to invest in and use effectively factors of production. Either price ceilings or price floors. Shouldn't be too surprising, given our analysis of price ceilings and price floors, that would have a negative impact. But again, this is mainly going to be an impact in the market for financial intermediation. Now, and you may want to think about that and come back to that later. Regulation of labor. Are there hiring regulations and a minimum wage? Hey, we've talked about minimum wages, haven't we? Are there hiring and firing regulations? By the way, when you see an S here, that means it's a survey instrument that Fraser or some other organization uses. So you might think that restrictions on firing would increase the amount of labor that people are using, but as I mentioned before, if it's effectively impossible to fire people, you're almost certainly never going to hire them, and if you make it hard to hire people, you're also going to get fewer people hired. And so in that case, we will use labor less effectively. There will be less incentive to use labor, and there will be less incentive for private individuals to invest in human capital. We can talk about centralized collective bargaining. Again, that yields less economic freedom. In some countries, such as Germany, the workers' unions have a representative on the board, or at least it's required that all companies within a given industry negotiate together, thus decreasing economic freedom and also then decreasing the incentive for people to invest in and use effectively the factors of production. Are there regulations on when shops can be open? Again, if you ever go visit Germany or some countries in Europe, don't plan on buying any groceries on Sundays, because pretty much all of the grocery stores by law are not open on Sunday. So gas stations, you can probably get some food there, but you're not going to be able to find things at grocery stores because they are closed by law. Thus, again, almost certainly decreasing people's incentives to invest in and use effectively the factors of production. Mandated cost of worker dismissal, again, that may not be viewed as a bad thing, but if we make it costly to fire people, we're almost certainly going to end up hiring fewer people. And then again here, conscription, this would be, do we have a draft? Are people by law required to serve in the military? Again, decreasing the incentive to invest in human capital, probably. How about the regulation of business? Well, we can have price controls, and that shouldn't be a surprise to you that decreases overall well-being, probably decreases economic growth, and definitely decreases economic freedom. Hopefully you can all diagram these at this point. We also have administrative requirements and bureaucracy costs of compliance. How hard is it to start a business? Do you have to pay any bribes? Are there licensing restrictions? Now, you may think that that's something of many other countries, but actually that's one of the main areas in this country why economic freedom has gone in the crapper, is because of extensions of licensing into a bunch of industries. And here we also have the cost of tax compliance. In other words, the time and energy that people have to engage in to comply with tax laws. Now, as most of you know, filing taxes is kind of a pain in the backside in this country. In most other countries, you never file taxes. They just tell you how much you owe them, which seems to be a far more sensible situation, given that they know your income. And it's a little bit, seems to me, a little bit perverse in this country that that I have to hire somebody to tell the government how much I owe the government, at which point the government officials can turn around and say, no, you're completely wrong. But anyways, that varies from country to country. There's various tax compliance issues. So that basically, I think, incorporates the indices here. And that leads us to the next question of how useful these are. So hopefully you understand them. You understand why they, on balance, probably decrease the incentives to invest in factors of production if they're poor, and if they're good, why they increase the incentive to invest in and to use effectively the factors of production. But of course, what we care about isn't just these institutions. To a large extent, now we might care about just economic freedom for its own good. And I think there's a definite argument that can be made that more freedom, economic freedom, the freedom to do what we wish with our property, including ourselves, as long as it doesn't interfere with other people's rights, is probably an unabated good thing. Now, but that's a separate... or that's an additional argument. We could also say to somebody might say, but I don't care about that. So why should I care about these measures? And so here I haven't, again, in an effort to get these out, have not necessarily updated these. These are from last year's index. Basically, here's the question of, are these measures of institutions useful for predicting GDP per capita or income per capita? And the answer is yes. Absolutely. Now, by the way, note at the bottom here, their note that says income equals GDP per capita in constant purchasing power parity US dollars 2017. So let's unpack that. It's GDP per capita. In other words, it's GDP in a country divided by the population. So this isn't the amount that everybody gets. It would be the average income. Constant PPP, purchasing power parity. That we're going to come to when we talk about exchange rates. That's basically, again, a way of making sure we're using constant units of measurement. And this is measured in US dollars, not Singaporean dollars or Australian dollars. And it is in 2017 dollars. Again, all of this will hopefully make a little bit more sense to you later on when we get to that sector. But just note that it is important. So let's look at the relationship here. Most free, those, if we break this into quartiles, in other words, 25%, the least free 25%, the second to least free 25%, the second to most free 25%, and then the most free 25%, we look at GDP per capita in those areas, and we are looking at a radical difference here. Going from least free to most free yields a 499% increase in income. And again, this is purchasing power parity adjusted. So we'll talk more about that later, but in other words, this is adjusted for the local cost of living. This is not that it's, right? This isn't the case that rent in a poor country is $100 a year and it's, $10,000 a year in New York City, which good luck finding an apartment in New York City for that. No, but the key here is that this is adjusted for the purchasing power parity. And so what this means is basically people in the most free, again, there's going to be some issues on the extent to which GDP is a measure of well-being. It's definitely a measure of income. So people in the most free are making more than five times the income of people in the least free. And going from the third quartile to the most free yields a tripling in income. And going from the second quartile to the most free quartile is more than a 50% increase in income. And so this makes, in terms of income, this clearly makes a difference. And so this is partially our sniff test. Do greater institutions or better institutions more economic freedom? Does that increase people's incentives to invest in and use effectively the factors of production? And the answer is clearly yes, as measured by GDP. But maybe we care not just about income. Maybe what we care about is life expectancy. Now, as you probably have anticipated from the Rosling video here, again, going from the least free to the most free, In terms of life expectancy at birth, now it's a side note, life expectancy can be measured in a variety of ways. It turns out to be a lot more complicated and nuanced than many of us are used to thinking, but life expectancy at birth is different between the least free and the most free. Now again, it doesn't look like a huge difference, but if we were to go from the least free to the most free, here the increase in life expectancy at birth is about 22%. Now that's nowhere near the 500%. And so it does look like economic freedom yields more improvements in income than it does necessarily in life expectancy. Although, as we've also seen, right, there still is this difference. And there's also reasons to suspect that there will be diminishing returns in life expectancy. Going from 45 to 65 may be relatively easy. Going from 65 to 80 is probably significantly more difficult. But the key here again is the Fraser Index meaningful at measuring things we care about beyond just income? And I would argue that it certainly does. How about infant mortality rate? I think we can hopefully all agree that kids dying, in other words, infants per, so in this case, a low number is a good thing because we're looking at the infants who die per 1,000 live births. So in the least free, about 41 kids out of every 1,000 who are born live die. And die as an infant. And I don't know what the cutoff is as an infant. It's probably before the age of 2 or 3. So this isn't just that people, right? Because the mortality rate per 1,000 live births is, of course, 1,000. None of us live forever. But we're talking about infant mortality here, not overall mortality. Now, in the most free, we're looking at around 7 kids per 1,000 that are born live, that make it to birth alive. Only about 7 of them die. So that's a radical reduction and an important one. And so again, maybe we're not just talking about life expectancy, we're talking about infant mortality, we're talking about income. And I think on those measures, it's pretty clear that having a better set of institutions yields things that we care about, yields positive things that we care about, and less of the negative things that we don't want. Now let's look at the poorest. And again, as I've tried to emphasize in this class, at least I believe that one of the marks of a society is how it treats its poor and socially marginal. So on this front, the income share of the poorest 10%. So in the least free, the poorest 10% get about 2.5% of the income. In the most free, about 2.75% the bottom 10% yield gets about 2.75% of national income. Again, this is pretty darn close. So the bottom 10% is a little bit better off in the most free, a little bit worse off in the second most free. But I would say that largely these are pretty close and there's not a huge difference. So on this margin, you might want to be poor in the most free, but it's kind of a crapshoot. You probably wouldn't care all that much. Now, if we go and look, however, not at the income share of the poorest, again, this would be income as the poor people's income as a percentage of all income, right? If we instead looked at their income, now when we go from the least free, and again, if you look at the bottom, this is the annual income per capita of the poorest 10%, and this is in constant purchasing power parity US dollars, although this time in terms of 2016 US dollars. So again, this is adjusted for cost of living. So the poorest 10% in the least free countries make only around $1,500 a year. And the poorest 10% in the most free countries earn around $11,000 or somewhere between $10,000 and $11,000. So while previously it didn't make a huge difference on the previous slide, whether you were poor in the least free or the third or the second or the most free, I think it's pretty clear from this picture, if you had to pick a place to be poor, where would you rather be poor? I would much rather be poor in the most free. And if I couldn't be part of the most free, I would choose to be poor in the second most free, right? This clearly says that if what we care about is the poor and socially marginal, economic freedom does not yield a situation where we dispossess the poor and socially marginal, which is encouraging. I find that very encouraging. How about poverty rates? Extreme and moderate poverty rates. Again, there's the question of how we define this. Are we talking about relative or absolute? In this case, we are talking about absolute poverty. People who are living on less than $1.90 a day, that's determined to be extreme poverty, and moderate poverty is $3.20 a day, again, in purchasing power parity adjusted dollars. In other words, adjusted for the cost of living. And so again, extreme poverty is much lower in the most free, and it is second lowest in the second most free, and so on and so forth. So in the least free countries, more than 25% of the population is living in extreme poverty, and almost half of the population is living in moderate poverty. Whereas in the most free countries, less than 2% of the population is living in extreme poverty, and less than, right around 5% is living in moderate poverty. So again, even if you don't care about average income or life expectancy or infant mortality, if you care about the poor and socially marginal, you also would want better institutions and a higher ranking in the Fraser Index. How about civil liberties? Here, the highest, political and civil liberties are measured on a scale of 1 to 7. In this case, they've inverted the scale. A low number is good, so they actually put a low number at the top and a high number at the bottom. You'll notice it ranges, it's sort of an odd scale. They could have done it in the inverted fashion, just like we had earlier with the extreme and moderate poverty rates, but they chose to do it the other way. And so again, here, economic freedom has a positive impact, or is positively related to political rights and civil liberties. So even if you say, I don't care about GDP, and I don't care about income, and I don't care about material well-being, and I don't care about infant mortality, of course, I find it very hard for people to say, I don't care about infant mortality of the poor. I find that to be very deeply troubling. But say that all you care about is civil liberties. Again, we would want to have better institutions in order to get there. How about gender inequality? Again, in this instance, a low number is a good thing. It turns out that gender inequality, as measured by Gini coefficient, we can talk more about that later, but basically, countries with greater economic freedom have less gender inequality. So maybe you say, look, I don't care about infants, and I don't care about the poor. I just care about gender inequality. Well, in that case, again, you should care about institutions. How about happiness? Now, I'm somewhat suspicious about the happiness literature. It's not very robust to small changes in how you ask questions, but to the extent that you believe the literature on happiness and that these indices make a big difference, basically, again, going from 4.59 to 6.45 on a self-evaluation of happiness, there is a positive relationship, at least in the UN data. So it turns out, again, if we want to talk about the takeaway from this, the Fraser Index measures institutional outcomes, even though what we care about is the institutions themselves. Of course, that shouldn't be too surprising. Measuring the underlying phenomenon is probably going to be difficult, if not next to impossible. Some of what it measures, however, is probably causal. It does affect directly. It's not just a proxy for what we care about. But when it's not causal, it's definitely a proxy. And it also turns out that we should care about institutions, not just because it increases GDP, although GDP is, as we're going to talk about later, a measure that is useful about social coordination, but it increases a whole bunch of other things that we almost certainly should and could care about.